Staying truly informed today feels like a constant effort, doesn't it? There's just so much out there.
It really does. Information overload is real.
That's why we do this. We take a significant topic, sift through the details, and, well, extract what's really crucial for you to understand.
Think of it as gaining a focused understanding, getting to the heart of the matter without having to wade through mountains of information yourself.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a subject that is both vital and, frankly, deeply unsettling: physical and sexual abuse among school children.
A heavy topic, but essential.
Our primary source for this is a 1993 article from the Educational Psychology Review by Marla P. Peterson titled "Physical and Sexual Abuse Among School Children: Prevalence and Prevention."
And it's a really useful article because it synthesizes a lot of what was known back then. It draws heavily from the 1986 National Incidence Study, NIS2. That was a big one from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Right. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive is clear: to unpack the core insights Peterson presents.
Exactly. We'll be looking at how these different forms of abuse are defined, what the reported prevalence was, according to this research anyway, the impact these experiences have on children.
Some of the characteristics that were observed in abusers, and importantly, the complexities surrounding prevention programs in schools. It's not straightforward.
Not at all. By the end of our discussion, you should have a much more thorough grasp of these critical issues, at least as they were understood based on this important work from '93.
Okay, so let's start by laying the groundwork with the language used. Peterson's article really stresses how important it is to have clear definitions from the outset.
Yeah, absolutely critical. She explains that maltreatment is the overarching term, kind of the umbrella.
And it includes both abuse, which she terms acts of commission, so things that are done to a child.
And neglect, which are acts of omission, things the child needs but doesn't receive, failures to act.
Okay, and what's interesting here is the precision in her definitions. Physical abuse isn't just a general idea of harm.
No, it's specifically defined as the intentional infliction of physical injury. And she gives concrete examples that really bring it into focus, like shaking a child, hitting or beating them, burning, even biting, things you can often see.
Similarly, sexual abuse is detailed as subjecting a child to any sexually stimulating act. And this covers a wide spectrum, right?
It does, from, fondling and oral stimulation to much more severe acts like incest and rape. But it also includes exploitation like pornography and obscene phone calls.
Right, and we also need to understand emotional abuse. The article describes this as the ways a caregiver speaks and acts that really undermine a child's healthy emotional and social development.
Yeah, and this can manifest in different ways, making excessive demands on a child, isolating them for unreasonable amounts of time, or using scare tactics. That last one is specifically mentioned in the context of trying to stop kids from talking about sexual abuse.
Then we have neglect, those acts of omission. This gets broken down too.
It does. There's physical neglect, failure to provide basics like food, shelter, clothing.
Medical neglect, lack of necessary medical treatment, though there's that ongoing legal discussion around exceptions for religious beliefs.
Right, that's a complex area. Then emotional neglect, just a failure to show basic care and concern for a child's emotional well-being.
And educational neglect, not ensuring a child has the opportunity to learn, like not enrolling them in school or allowing chronic truancy without good reason.
And Peterson makes a really crucial point here, something for you, the listener, to be aware of. The significant challenge of inconsistent definitions in this field of research.
Oh, definitely. It seems that even back then, and probably still today, different studies, different states even, could have slightly different working definitions of what counts as abuse or neglect.
Which, as you can imagine, makes it much harder to draw firm comparisons and, broad conclusions across different pieces of research. It muddies the waters.
Absolutely. So with those definitions as our foundation, the article then gets into the reported incidents of maltreatment, focusing, like the title says, on physical and sexual abuse.
And to really understand this, we need to discuss the National Incidence Studies, the NIS.
Yes, the NIS. Peterson highlights the first one, NIS-1, back in 1980, and then the one that's more central for us today, NIS-2, completed in 1986. These were significant national efforts by HHS to try and figure out the scope of the problem.
What's particularly insightful about these studies, for you to understand, is their methodology. They didn't just rely on official reports. That's key.
Right. They looked at cases known to professionals, like social workers, teachers.
And cases known to non-professionals, neighbors, relatives. And they even tried to estimate the number of cases that were likely happening but hadn't been reported to anyone. That unreported segment is crucial.
How did they do that exactly?
Well, for NIS2, they gathered data from a national sample of counties over several months. They interviewed community professionals and then used statistical methods to estimate annual figures for the whole country. They also tried hard to avoid double counting, focusing on the number of affected children, not just the number of reports filed.
And a really critical aspect for understanding the findings, NIS2 evaluated these reported cases against two different sets of criteria, two definitions.
Exactly. The first set was designed to be consistent with NIS1, focusing on cases with clear, demonstrable harm. This let them compare 1986 numbers with 1980 to see if things had changed.
In the second set.
The second was broader. It included children considered endangered by maltreatment, meaning they were at significant risk of harm, even if, demonstrable harm hadn't actually occurred yet. It's a lower threshold.
Okay, so let's first look at what they found under that demonstrable harm definition, the stricter one.
Right. In 1986, the study estimated about 16 out of every 1,000 children in the U.S. That translates to over 1 million kids nationwide had experienced abuse or neglect meeting this threshold.
Over 1 million. Wow. But here's a key insight for you. This represented a substantial 66% increase in the number of countable cases since just 1980.
A huge jump. And what's even more striking is that the vast majority of that increase, a full 74%, was specifically due to a rise in reported abuse cases, not neglect.
And within those abuse cases,
both physical and sexual abuse saw significant increases. Physical abuse reports were up by 58%, but reported sexual abuse, well, it more than tripled compared to 1980.
More than triple. That's really dramatic.
It is. The study also noted a significant 89% increase in reported moderate injuries related to maltreatment.
But interestingly, under this demonstrable harm definition, the reported incidence of emotional abuse and neglect didn't show any statistically reliable changes between 80 and 86.
Correct. Now, when we turn to the findings using the broader endangered definition from 1986, the estimated numbers are, unsurprisingly, even higher.
How much higher?
The study suggested around 25 out of every 1,000 children, that's over 1.5 million children across the country, were endangered by abuse or neglect.
Okay, 1.5 million under the broader definition, and the breakdown between abuse and neglect.
In this wider category, neglect actually accounted for the majority of cases, about 63% of the total. Abuse constituted less than half, around 43%.
Interesting. So neglect was more prevalent under the broader definition. Can we break down the types further?
Yeah, under endangered, the rates were. Physical abuse, roughly 5.7 per 1,000 children. Emotional abuse, 3.4 per 1,000. And sexual abuse, 2.5 per 1,000.
And for neglect?
Physical neglect was the highest at 9.1 per 1,000, educational neglect at 4.6 per 1,000, and emotional neglect at 3.5 per 1,000.
So, to summarize for the listener, sexual abuse showed the biggest relative increase under demonstrable harm, but physical neglect was the most frequently identified issue overall when using the broader endangered criteria.
Precisely. Now, what's also important for you to consider is an observation made by the authors of the NIS2 study themselves.
What was that?
They proposed that the big increase in reported child abuse and neglect between 80 and 86 was likely more a result of increased awareness and recognition by professionals rather than an actual increase in the events themselves.
Are we seeing more, or are we just getting better at seeing it?
Exactly. But as Peterson points out in her article, the NIS2 study didn't actually have specific data to definitively support that explanation. It's a plausible suggestion, but, not proven fact from that study.
Right. And the article also briefly touches on other national studies looking at this, like the American Humane Association's annual data collection.
Yeah, they started that back in '75. But Peterson mentions its usefulness for broader comparisons is kind of limited. Why? Because the legal definitions of abuse and neglect vary state by state.
And not all states consistently report their data either.
Right. Makes it patchy. Then there's the work of Gels and Strauss. They did national telephone surveys in '75 and '85, asking parents about physical punishment.
And what did they find?
Interestingly, their research found a decrease in self-reported physical abuse by parents during that decade.
A decrease. That seems counter to the NIS findings.
It does. But the researchers themselves acknowledged a crucial point for you to think about. It's hard to know if this was a genuine decline or if people just became less willing to admit to such behavior in a survey over time. Social desirability bias.
Good point. So Peterson emphasizes this persistent challenge. Varying definitions, different reporting practices makes it really complex to compare findings across studies.
Definitely. though she does note that the trends in the American Humane Association data generally seem to align with the NIS findings regarding overall prevalence and within specific categories. So there was some consistency there.
Okay, so we're starting to get a clearer picture of the situation as it was understood back then. Now, Peterson's article moves on to highlight some specific demographic patterns related to physical and sexual abuse from NIS2. These are important details for you to be aware of.
Yeah, what's striking here is how these patterns unfolded. We already mentioned reported sexual abuse more than tripled, but the demographic breakdown, it reveals a really significant disparity. Females were reported as being sexually abused almost 4 times as often as males. 4 times. That's a stark difference.
Wow, 4 times. And what about physical abuse? Any demographic links?
Age seemed to be a notable factor there. Children aged 0 to 2 were less often reported as physically abused compared to older kids. And those aged 3 to 5 were also less likely than kids aged 12 and over.
Tragically.
Tragically, yes. Fatalities from maltreatment were more frequently reported among the very youngest children, while moderate injuries were more prevalent in the older age groups.
What about race or ethnicity?
Interestingly, the NIS2 data did not find any significant relationship between the reported incidence of maltreatment and a child's race or ethnicity.
But socioeconomic factors.
Yes. They seem to play a very significant role. Children from families with lower annual incomes, defined as under $15,000 a year back then, were reported to experience both physical and sexual abuse at rates 4 times higher than kids from higher income families.
4 times higher. That's a powerful statistic. Really highlights potential links between economic hardship and vulnerability.
It certainly suggests a strong correlation. And finally, concerning physical abuse specifically, there was a connection observed with family size.
How so?
Families with 4 or more children had a higher reported rate of physical abuse, 7.8 per 1,000 kids compared to smaller families. Families with 1 child were at 4.5 per 1,000, and 2 to 3 kids were 5.7 per 1,000. Those smaller family sizes weren't statistically different from each other, but the larger families stood out.
Okay, so these demographic patterns give us a more detailed picture of potential risk factors, although it's crucial, as you said, abuse can happen anywhere to anyone.
Absolutely crucial to remember that. The article then shifts focus to symptomatology, the signs and symptoms you might see in children being abused, and the characteristics associated with abusers themselves.
Yeah.
This is really important stuff for people working with kids.
Yes, absolutely. As Peterson emphasizes, school staff are often in a unique position. They see kids regularly, day in, day out. They can play a vital role in identifying potential cases.
So for physical abuse, the article lists several physical symptoms that might raise concerns. Things like, unexplained bruises, broken bones, lacerations, burns, especially cigarette burns.
Swollen areas, missing hair, bite marks.
Frequent injuries, or injuries that look like they're at different stages of healing. That last one can suggest repeated incidents.
Right. Also, if a child gives bizarre or just implausible explanations for their injuries.
Big red flag. Or if the parents' explanations are inadequate or inconsistent with each other, or with what the child says.
Even things like habitual lateness or absence from school could be a sign, maybe being kept home until physical evidence fades.
It could be. And any significant delay in seeking medical help for injuries or getting treatment that seems inappropriate for the injury, those are critical indicators too.
Beyond the physical signs, there are potential behavioral or personality changes as well.
Yes, Peterson cites Cohn, who noted that kids experiencing physical abuse might show one of 2 seemingly opposite patterns.
Like what?
They could become excessively compliant, very shy, withdrawn, uncommunicative.
Sure.
Or the opposite, extreme nervous, hyperactive, aggressive, disruptive, even destructive.
So either extreme withdrawal or extreme acting out could be a warning sign.
Exactly. Either should be a cause for concern and warrant, further attention.
And the impact of physical abuse can go even deeper, affecting a child's sensory development, their understanding of the world. Peterson quotes Heffer on this.
Yeah, they're a really vivid description. Heffer talks about how when physical touch consistently means pain, when certain smells get linked with bad experiences, when parents mostly communicate with threats and anger, well, a child learns it might be safer not to listen, not to look, and definitely not to be touched.
Those learned responses, they can have really significant, long-lasting developmental consequences.
Absolutely. And psychologically, Heffer suggests growing up in that environment can hinder the development of decision-making skills.
How so?
Because kids are either constantly told what to do with no explanation, or given no direction and then criticized, or just punished regardless of their choices. It breeds helplessness.
It can also lead to a deep-seated sense of distrust in others. Right. Learning that caregivers can also cause pain.
Exactly. And crucially, they might struggle to separate their internal feelings from their external actions, maybe believing they have little or no control over what happens to them.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to the characteristics often associated with individuals who perpetrate physical abuse. Peterson points out stress is often there, but it's not the sole cause.
Right. Stress is a factor, but not the whole story. She mentions the concept from Justice and Justice that some families or even social contexts might be, quote, culturally or socially scripted to respond to stress with violence.
Like it's the default reaction they've learned or seen.
Sort of, yeah. The article refers to a study by Strauss and Cantor that looked into factors mediating that stress abuse link.
And what did they find?
Well, individuals who'd witnessed their own fathers hitting their mothers and who'd experienced physical punishment themselves as kids were more likely to use violence when stressed as adults. Makes sense, sadly.
What else?
Parents who believed physical punishment and even minor violence against a spouse were acceptable. Higher rates of child abuse. Marital dissatisfaction, frequent physical fights between parents, also significant risk factors.
Did education level matter on its own?
Interestingly, not directly in mediating stress and abuse, but the combination of low income, low education, and low status occupation did have an impact.
And social isolation.
Linked to higher abuse rates. Being involved in supportive social networks seemed protective, except, kind of surprisingly, having a large number of relatives living nearby was associated with higher reported rates. Not entirely sure why that might be.
Interesting. And Justice and Justice's work. What else did they find about abusive parents?
They really underscore that abusive parents often see violence as a legitimate way to solve problems, or they grew up where violence was just common. Their research comparing abusive and non-abusive parents found the abusive group was significantly more likely to report family violence in their own childhood.
That cycle of violence idea.
Pretty much. They also found abusive parents tend to struggle more with change, especially rapid or excessive change, though they stress this is more a predisposing vulnerability, not a direct cause on its own.
Justice and Justice also describe something called a symbiotic scenario. What's that?
It's this idea of a constant, often unconscious competition within the family for nurturing and care. Like if one spouse feels deprived in the adult relationship, they might inappropriately turn to a child to meet those unmet needs.
And when the child inevitably fails to meet those adult expectations?
It can trigger violence,
Yeah.
especially as violence is already seen as an acceptable way to handle frustration in that family. It creates this damaging cycle where even basic discipline or decision-making becomes a huge source of conflict.
What other issues did they report frequently in abusive families?
Things like sexual difficulties between partners, pervasive distrust often linked to their own histories, financial instability, problems with in-laws. And they make this important point. While some stress is unavoidable, a lot of the chaos and disruption in abusive families is actually self-induced. Chaos and violence become almost accepted norms.
Okay, a grim picture. Let's shift focus now to sexual abuse. Peterson points out there are quite a few potential behavioral indicators, maybe 30 to 40 different signs.
Yeah, things like a sudden drop in self-esteem, nightmares, depression, withdrawal, school difficulties, sometimes unusual compliance or passivity.
But she stresses a really important point for you, the listener, to understand.
Absolutely. The presence of several of these indicators does not automatically confirm sexual abuse is happening, but it should definitely prompt further sensitive inquiry and investigation. Don't jump to conclusions, but don't ignore the signs either.
However, Peterson also highlights certain behaviors that are much more strongly indicative of sexual abuse, less likely to be caused by other things. She cites Conti here.
Right. Conti points to things like age-inappropriate sexual language or actions by a child, sexualized behavior with peers, toys, even animals, showing new or atypical sexual knowledge beyond their age.
And any physical trauma to the genital or anal areas, those are rarely caused by anything other than sexual abuse.
Yeah, those are very strong indicators.
The article then gets into the effects of sexual abuse, early and long term. It draws on Finkelhor's 1990 update to a big review he did with Brown in '86.
Right. Back then, they identified common symptoms in child victims. Most frequent were fear, anxiety, depression, anger, and interestingly, engaging in sexually inappropriate behaviors themselves.
And the long-term consequences.
The patterns often included persistent depression, self-destructive behaviors, ongoing anxiety, social isolation, low self-esteem, trouble trusting others,
An increased risk of being re-victimized later in life.
substance abuse issues, and difficulties with sexual adjustment in adulthood. Finkelhor notes that research since then has largely supported and reinforced those earlier findings. It's a devastating list.
One area that got more attention after 86 was the specific impact on boys, right?
Yes. Interestingly, studies showed surprising similarity in the initial stress responses of both boys and girls after disclosure. Fear, sleep problems, distractibility.
But perceptions might differ.
Yeah, research by Tong and colleagues found that while parents and teachers might rate boys as less symptomatic than girls, the boys themselves reported experiencing just as many symptoms.
Why the difference in perception?
Finkelhor suggests it might relate to who the abuser is. Boys are statistically more likely to be abused by someone outside the family, girls more often by someone within. That could affect how and when it's disclosed and maybe the observable symptoms. It raises important questions.
A study on college students by Urquiza and Crowley found some gender differences in reported long-term effects, too.
It did. Women in that study were somewhat more likely to report depression. Men were more likely to express a desire to harm others and, disturbingly, to report sexual interest in children.
But it's crucial to note.
Absolutely crucial. Both groups, men and women who had experienced childhood sexual abuse, reported significantly higher levels of depression, sleep problems, PTSD symptoms, low self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, and sexual problems compared to their non-abused peers. The distress was elevated across the board.
And Finkelhor emphasizes that most research focused on these stress-related symptoms. There's a need for more research on how sexual abuse impacts other critical skills.
Exactly. Things like problem-solving, thinking patterns, self-concept, communication skills. We need a broader understanding of the cognitive and social impacts.
That's a really important point for you, the listener, to consider. If kids who've experienced sexual abuse process information differently due to trauma, it could have huge implications for learning, including in the classroom.
And as the article comes back to later, it could affect how they understand and process info in abuse prevention programs themselves. It's a critical connection.
Finally, on the characteristics of individuals who perpetrate sexual abuse, Peterson notes that personality tests like the MMPI haven't found a single consistent profile.
Right. No easy sex offender profile. She explains that because sexual abuse varies so widely, and we still need more research on arousal patterns, fantasies, cognitive distortions, well, a simple universal profile just isn't feasible.
But Steele points out that different underlying psychological factors might be at play depending on the victim's age and gender.
Yes. And interestingly, Steele also notes that individuals who sexually abuse children often share some common symptoms and background experiences with physical abusers.
Like what?
Low self-esteem, poor sense of identity, social isolation, a history of emotional deprivation, physical abuse, chaotic family life. Some common threads seem to emerge, even without a distinct profile.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Definitions, prevalence back then, symptoms in victims, characteristics of abusers. The article then transitions to a really critical area: school-based prevention programs.
Yes, their implementation and effectiveness.
And Peterson frames schools as one partner, but not the only partner in preventing child abuse. She points out that while schools often have a legal duty to report suspected abuse,
Their specific roles beyond reporting haven't always been clearly defined. It can be murky.
and often the motivation for schools implementing prevention programs has been a strong moral imperative, right? A desire to do something to protect kids.
Absolutely, a desire to eradicate this behavior, to do what feels ethically right. But, as you might be wondering, the crucial question is, what does the research actually say about what works? What's appropriate for schools? What are the potential pitfalls?
Exactly. What does the evidence tell us?
Well, the article first discusses different conceptual models for prevention. Heifer, for instance, identified 3 levels for physical abuse prevention.
Primary, secondary, tertiary.
Right. Primary aims to prevent it ever happening, like prenatal coaching for new parents. Secondary targets those already affected to stop it continuing or repeating in the next generation. And tertiary focuses on preventing recurrence after it's been identified.
Then Peterson introduces Finkelhor's model specifically for sexual abuse prevention.
Yeah, this one's influential. It suggests 4 key preconditions usually need to be met for sexual abuse to occur.
Okay, what are they?
1,
Yeah.
the offender needs the motivation. 2, they have to overcome their own internal inhibitions. 3, they need to overcome external obstacles or inhibitions. And 4, they need to overcome or undermine the child's resistance.
So prevention programs based on this model recognize its complex offender factors, child factors, family dynamics, societal influences.
Exactly. And school-based programs might primarily focus on that fourth precondition, trying to empower children, maybe kids who are emotionally insecure or lack knowledge about sexual abuse dynamics.
Okay, so what about the actual research findings on program effectiveness? Peterson highlights a fundamental challenge with primary prevention aimed at parents.
Yeah, the complex issue of parental rights. How much can or should external programs intervene in family life? It's a tricky balance.
But she does point to some promising approaches, like home visitation programs for at-risk families.
Yes, conducted by healthcare or education professionals. She cites a study by Gray and colleagues finding a correlation between participation and lower abuse-related hospitalizations. Other studies by Olds and Simmons also suggested positive influences.
But establishing direct causal links is hard, right?
Very hard. Too many interacting variables in families' lives. The evaluation of the Evans Parent-Child Education Program, for instance, explicitly avoided making cause and effect claims because of this complexity.
Tell us about the Evans program.
It worked with low-income, often poorly educated Mexican-American mothers of young kids, provided parenting classes, childcare support, home visits, a comprehensive approach.
And the results.
Evaluations showed significant improvements in mothers' attitudes towards physical punishment, their knowledge of child development, and importantly, a reported decrease in the severity of discipline they used. Positive signs.
Okay. The article then shifts focus to programs specifically for children and adolescents who have already experienced abuse. These really started developing in the 80s.
Yeah, more systematically studied then. Peterson mentions 4 key reviews of sexual abuse education programs for kids, summarized in Table I of her article, by Wertley, Conte al., Finkelhor, and Theringer et al.
And the 1988 review by Theringer and colleagues seems particularly insightful. They looked at 41 commercial prevention materials.
Yes. Their review highlighted a big challenge. How do you depict the nature of sexual abuse accurately and understandably for children? It's tough.
Many programs use that good touch, bad touch, confusing touch concept.
Very common, yeah. Based on Anderson's work. Most materials also acknowledge the difficult truth that abusers are often family members or trusted individuals, and abuse usually happens at home or nearby, less often at school.
What were the core messages these programs tried to convey?
A central focus was on 3 empowerment messages. 1, body ownership, your body belongs to you. 2, trust your feelings. If a touch feels wrong, it probably is. 3, you have the right to say no to unwanted advances, even from an adult.
But Theringer's team noted a lack of clear theoretical frameworks behind these programs, mostly just this implicit idea of empowerment.
Pretty much. They also observed that while most programs talked about redefining secrets, some secrets need to be shared and having support systems, there was surprisingly little emphasis on basic body knowledge and sexuality info in programs for kids compared to adult programs.
And perhaps the most significant finding from Theringer et al.'s review.
Yeah, this is the kicker. They concluded that, based on research available then, there was no empirical evidence suggesting these school programs actually prevented sexual abuse by teaching kids resistance techniques.
No evidence they prevented abuse. That's a really crucial point for you, the listener, to take away.
It really is. And this leads into a discussion of potential problems and unintended consequences Theringer's team identified.
Like what?
One concern was potential victim self-blame. If you teach kids they can protect themselves by saying no, what if they can't in a real situation? Could they feel responsible?
That's a serious concern. What else?
Another issue. If you isolate abuse prevention from broader age-appropriate sexuality education, could it give kids the impression that sexuality itself is just secretive, negative, dangerous?
Yeah, creating fear instead of understanding.
Exactly. They also raised practical concerns. School staff feeling untrained, unprepared to deliver these sensitive programs effectively or handle disclosures.
So given these findings and concerns, Theringer et al. Made a pretty pointed recommendation.
They did. They recommended the primary, clearly stated goal of school-based sexual abuse education should be disclosure and identification of existing abuse, not trying to teach kids how to physically ward off advances.
Because there was no evidence that worked.
Right. They reiterated that conclusion. No published research at the time showed the effectiveness of empowering kids to prevent abuse from happening in the first place.
Peterson then presents a summary from the National Committee on Child Abuse, key issues and recommendations for prevention programs.
Yeah, detailed in Table 2 of her article, it emphasized things like Programs must be developmentally appropriate, focus on practical safety skills, not resistance, involve parents,
Yeah.
train staff properly.
And integrate abuse prevention with other health and safety topics, right? Not isolate it.
Exactly. And rigorously evaluate programs to see if they actually work and what their impact is. Don't just assume good intentions equal good outcomes.
The article suggests more successful programs might build on interpersonal skills for younger kids, family life education for older ones, parent education for adults.
All built on a foundation of developmentally appropriate, accurate sex education, a more holistic approach.
Okay. The final section of Peterson's article digs into how learning theory might help design better prevention programs.
Yes, she emphasizes we need more research into how kids actually understand concepts related to abuse. And she suggests that coping mechanisms developed by abused children could significantly influence how they process information in prevention programs.
So maybe using established learning theories could create a stronger teaching framework.
That's the idea. She looks at behavioral and social learning theories first. Notes the National Committee's recommendations seem to align with these.
Like using behavioral rehearsal practicing responses to strangers with positive reinforcement.
Exactly. And she discusses Bandura's social learning theory modeling, how school staff, through their own actions, can model nonviolent conflict resolution and assertive communication. Kids learn by watching.
Then she turns to cognitive learning and information processing theories, raising questions about how kids receive, store, and retrieve abuse-related info.
Right. Like, how do they really grasp safe versus unsafe secrets, or good touch versus bad touch? She briefly explains the information processing model: sensory register, short-term memory, long-term memory.
And she connects this back to Heffer's earlier point about past negative experiences shaping perceptions.
Yeah. Could past trauma affect what a child even pays attention to in the sensory register? She even asks, could the gender of a teacher delivering a lesson trigger negative associations for a child abused by someone of that gender? It's a thought-provoking question for you to consider.
And she discusses how stuff in long-term memory, like worries or threats, could interfere with processing new info in short-term memory, like undermining the idea that some secrets need to be shared.
Exactly. This final section really underscores that many fundamental questions still needed answers back then, and likely still do, to ensure prevention programs are truly effective and account for how kids learn, especially those who've already experienced trauma.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we've explored the complexity of child abuse, defining it, tracking it. It's inherently difficult.
Yet the NIS2 data from the mid-80s gave a stark snapshot. That increase in reported sexual abuse rates was particularly concerning.
We examine the demographic patterns links to gender, age, socioeconomic status, highlighting vulnerabilities.
And the potential physical and psychological impacts on kids, profound, far-reaching. Plus, those characteristics sometimes associated with abusers.
And regarding school prevention programs, Peterson's analysis makes it clear good intentions aren't enough. There were significant challenges and limitations recognized even then.
Yeah, that lack of definitive evidence for effectiveness, the awareness of potential unintended consequences. It underlines the complexity. Derringer et al.'s recommendation to prioritize disclosure and identification seems really significant in that light.
Ultimately, this deep dive into Peterson's 93 article highlights the critical ongoing need for more rigorous research, not just on prevalence and effects, but on how abuse impacts learning and cognitive processing.
Absolutely. That understanding is essential for developing truly effective, ethically sound prevention strategies that genuinely support and protect kids without inadvertently causing more harm.
Which brings us to a crucial point for you, our listener, to consider. Given these complexities, the potential for unintended consequences, what are the most critical questions researchers, educators, policymakers should be prioritizing right now to truly and effectively support and protect vulnerable children?
It's a deeply important topic, heavy but vital, with far-reaching implications, and one that undoubtedly deserves your continued thought and exploration.